within those hospitals. And so when you're trying to figure out your percentages in that kind of setting, those calculations, since it's 100%, 50% for the long-term care unit, we do those calculations separately. So 100 acute care patient rooms, 30 subacute SNF rooms. We're going to determine that 50% based on those 30 rooms and keep the acute care 10% completely separate. Now, if one of those bleeds over and has more accessible rooms than they're required to have, you can't use those to help the other out, unfortunately. I don't know nationwide how many hospital systems we use on this. I know we've seen it in California and a little bit on the East Coast, but just not very much. I just wonder if the trend is to try to keep those separate. 223.4, as Bill talked about, is professional offices of healthcare providers. You asked the question, does this apply if they're licensed or not? Depends on who you ask. If you ask the OSHPI, they might give you an answer. If you ask BSA, they might give you a different answer. Unfortunately, because I don't know that there's a consistent answer that everybody's agreed to on that. 223.4 came from the old OSHPI section in the old CBCs, and that was 11.B.3.2. It talks about special medical and dental offices. And there are, as always, within the county building code, there are things, always going to be question marks, things that are undefined. I mentioned the healthcare committee. We're putting together a list of those question marks and places where we see holes. These are some of the things. Flags that were raised in my mind about things that are just still undefined. Medical care, where you just assume that people know what medical care is, but when you're trying to apply a code like this, it would be helpful to have that definition. General exam rooms that they talk about in 805, well, to me that means one thing, but if you talk to Bill, it might mean something different to him because he has an architecture background and I have a healthcare background, and it's just unclear in my mind about that definition. The CAM 211B kind of talks about that a little bit in my mind. It doesn't clear it up enough for me to really know how to apply that out in the field. They also use the term specific equipment, and anybody have any ideas what they would like that to be? Does it mean that thin table on the left or the wheelchair platform scale on the right? Is it talking about getting on and off of it? It's just a little too vague to me. So hopefully we can encourage them to clear up those questions. And the resident sleeping room, although the again notice did define this and clear that up pretty well, I thought. And because when I saw resident sleeping rooms, I thought it could be a patient in a long-term care SNF unit, or it could be one of those medical students that's working 48 hours in a room and they give them somewhere to sleep. And I wasn't sure about that, but they could have done that, but it does talk about the patient in the long-term care occupancy. So the unit of scoping is 204.15, where it says everything has to be accessible. And then the rest of the code in chapter 2 kind of tells you what does it pull things out, what doesn't have to be accessible. The interesting thing about this section is that statement there in bold. For example, not all medical care patient rooms are required to be accessible. Those that are not required to be accessible are not required to comply with these requirements. That's great, that makes sense. It's like non-accessible guest rooms in a hotel. That's where the doors you're with. Most people have trouble with. But California doesn't really let them get by with this so much. There are some requirements in Chapter 12 that you'll reference where you will have to think about some accessibility features in those non-accessible rooms, like red bars in the toilet rooms, the sink hand washing fixture would have to be accessible in those rooms, and a couple of other little things. So you'll want to look at those pre-closed. And Bill's going to talk about 805 in detail. The ADA numbering for 805 is significantly different from CDC. So when you start digging into that, that'll be a good one to think about.
Thank you. So let's talk about time to travel. This is a huge topic for hospitals. I know not all of them do hospital work, but even with medical office building work, remodeling is what we do in healthcare. It tons and tons of remodeling. So the path of travel issue is just, it's hard to overstate the big of an issue this is with us. We're going to go through this in detail, we're going to pick it apart, analyze it, and go through it slowly and carefully. So, what used to be 1134B.2.1 is now 11B-202.4. I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with this code section. This is a code language here. The path of travel requires you to provide the 5 elements there as part of your path of travel obligations. As I've said before, this is a big part. In my experience, at Autopod, a full 80% of our projects at Autopod are remodel projects. So the path of travel exercise is something you do 20 times a week when you're doing hospital work. So let's go through this, and we'll start with the question of what does tuning in? I guess it may be a pet peeve of mine. I go through this and I read it and we go, well, the path of travel to the specific area of alteration shall be provided. It's easy to read through that and not really focus on that. It doesn't say where you're coming from, which is the part of this. Where are you coming from? I have to provide the path to that area. Where's my starting point? And another pet peeve of mine, you see the word parking. Anyway, you all know it's a big part of what we do. We always make them sure the path of travel from the parking stall to the area of alteration. And I don't see parking listed at all here. I'm sure some of you are ahead of me. You know where this comes from. So you look at there. So in layman's terms, you would say your responsibility for your project starts at the property line. So if your guests are arriving by car, the starting point would be from the parking stalls. If your guests are arriving from down the street, they would be coming from the public way. If they're arriving by taxi or bus and being dropped off, your from would be from the passenger loading zone. Okay? Now, does it say that in the code anywhere? Well, some of you probably have already been there. The definition of path of travel in the code I put on the screen here, it does refer specifically to existing buildings and remodels, parking areas, an exterior approach, and other parts of the facility. So what I gleaned from that is that it does apply to this definition, applies to remodel projects. This definition refers to the public way or exterior approach. It does refer to parking areas. But I've looked and looked, and I don't find anywhere here where they refer to passenger loading zones. Now, I'm not saying you don't have to do it. In our opinion, passenger loading zones is covered under the understanding of other parts of the facility. It's not something I can put my finger on. It says it right there, but it's, I believe, a reasonable interpretation of what you're supposed to do with path of travel. You're supposed to provide provide a path to the area of operation. Okay, now, let's shift gears here and talk a little bit about toilet facilities. So, healthcare facilities, we have lots and lots and lots of toilets. The code requires, under the access compliance scoping section, separate toilet rooms for the separate user groups. That's sort of a generic statement. So when we get into healthcare facilities, plumbing code, garage code 1, 2, 3, and 4, they require separate toilet facilities for the use of patients, staff, and visitors. And then the plumbing code says you have to have separate toilet rooms for each sex when the occupant load exceeds, it used to be 10, and now it says 50. So OSHPD is extremely aware of this, and they enforce this on every single one of those remodel projects. They will say, oh, okay, you need separate, you're remodeling your building, the area of operation is have the travel obligation for the toilet rooms. That means male and female toilet rooms for the staff, male and female toilet rooms for the visitors, and toilet rooms for the patients. So this exercise in the hospital means you're tracing down 5 toilet rooms for your remodel project. I'm going to give you a quick story on this one. Back in my previous life, when I was doing plan checking for my client who was there, we were doing electronic healthcare record projects. It's pretty common for most healthcare facilities. I think CASI has been doing these too. The nature of the project is you've got a whole bunch of different rooms throughout the hospital that you're putting in electronic health records, which is a monitor, a computer monitor being mounted on the walls with a computer. That's the project, occurring in 100 different rooms throughout the hospital. So theoretically, each and every one of those rooms, you have to trace down 5 toilet rooms because they serve the area that you're altering. And in the case of a couple of these, it amounted to such an enormous undertaking. It was like you were completely remodeling the entire hospital and bringing the whole thing up to access compliance because of this health records project. And ultimately, we went to OSHPD, got hat in hand, and said, please, give us a break here. And which they did. They were reasonable in this case. But the implications of this are very far-reaching. Any questions about how this is played? Steve?
Yeah. These sections of the code where it talks about how to travel from the public area or park to the area of operation. What about exiting?
Exiting.
I always struggle with that part.
I can't throw it on the screen here, but the exiting types of egress are exempt from remodel projects.
Yeah. That's one exception.
Yeah. So fortunately, it doesn't trigger that. Other than that, if you are for existing users,
why only the unisex for the patient restrooms? Why not both sexes?
well, it depends. I'm glad you brought that up. Most of the time, it's unisex. Now, the garden variety version of that is you have a patient bedroom. And the patient bedroom has a bed, and they've got a toilet room right there. Well, they don't make you put 2 of them in there. Now, when you're in the diagnostic and treatment areas of a hospital, you've got a radiology unit. In the radiology unit, you'll have patient toilet rooms. Usually, those are accepted as unisex, that you'll have 2 or 3 or 4 toilet rooms and they're all unisex. The thinking is if you've got less than 10 patients in that area, it doesn't trigger the separate male and female thing. But it's a loosey-goosey interpretation. Anybody receive any different interpretations on that?
Well, when I called Blue Dog, he said patients are patients, there's no
Right, cool, where's okay, thank you, Bill. All right, any questions about move on? So then the OSHPD can, I guess the big picture here, I'm going to make you aware of the two healthcare work OSHPD work. OSHPD has on their website what they call canons. It's synonymous to DSAs and IRs. The code application notice for living leaders I was mentioning earlier, I had a hand in writing this. I want to take you through a little bit of it. We're not going to go into a lot of details if we don't have the time for it, but they cover 14 different topics in this. Out of those 14 topics, I think I've just a couple of them. This was interesting. Structural repair actually triggers access to sites. And this is a function of, in hospital work, due to the earthquakes, hospitals have to up their standards for structural. So when they do that, this actually went to the California State Supreme Court, the Attorney General ruled on it. Yes, these kind of projects do trigger access. So then the question becomes, how do you do that? Because the project may be up on the roof, or it may be shear wall work, it may be strengthening beam and column connections. How does that, so the CAN goes through and explains kind of how you do that. See,
what about facade upgrade on a storm? It has a structural element to it, but it's not like a siding retrofit or.
Yeah, I remember doing one of these similar, it was a caulking project. You go through the exceptions, and they've got roofing is accepted out, mechanical, electrical, but it's not any of those. So what we ended up doing, I mean, it's a case by case, seat of the pants kind of interpretation, and it goes back to why I made the point. The building jurisdiction will have an interpretation. They're going to have to interpret what does it mean for this kind of project. What we did in that one is we said, well, we're just going to check essentially the entry lobby. You have toilet rooms, drinking fountains, telephones, traffic travel from the main lobby, and we'll call it good. It's a great question. I'm not sure. Has anybody else run into other scenarios? Yeah, Chris.
Well, in the building department, we had it all the time, and we said, well, what does it have to travel to the facade? There is no path to travel to the facade. So, yeah, the facade has to comply if there's a roll above 80 inches, yada, 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 but there's no path to travel. So, you don't go inside the building to work on the facade. So, we would take that vote pretty much.
How do you mean? I'm sorry? Well, so in my world, you have to make a call with the building official. Does this work require a building permit or not? Once it requires a permit, it ends up in our world of letting this code section. If it's maintenance work, you're replacing the widget down in the mechanical room, and it doesn't require a building permit, it won't trigger any of this. Well, I give you guys a point. They submitted it to us when I was in Australia, and I checked that they gave us a fee. Well, they probably could have done that and that.
Okay, so once you've actually reviewed it, then it's sort of off the ante, is that?
Yeah, well, then the project I'm thinking of, they actually had water intrusion issues. They had water coming in from the outside south-facing wall, 9 stories, and then they had all their toilet rooms leaking. So they had all these water intrusion issues from both sides, and there was a lot of plumbing work and pumping.
So there's some repair.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, there's a philosophical question about this. Model ADA or something requires trigger issues. In some cases, you're spending money on buildings to improve that facility. And a lot of the thing I can come back to the concept of what ADA is, that we improve the facility and improve access. So at what point does finding out or interpretation still leaves you open to legal obligation because, you spend so much money in the facility and not good access.
Well, and, I can speak to that. We've got lawsuits, of course, everybody can. And I think, to be honest, a lot of people that are architects can appreciate, we've all been doing remodeling for years on the townhomes. And that doesn't, I'm saying 80% of what occupiers see the remodel does. And then you go out for 15 or 20 years of that, you would think the building has been pretty well upgraded. But it's not, because everybody keeps going, well, we're going to use that toilet room, it's already accessible, and not fix this one. And they keep doing that, so you never quite get to the point where you've done it. And at this point, lawsuits kick in, and they force you to do it. Yeah, there's a philosophical issue there. Chris?
versus something that, well, it's broken, now it's actually repaired, that's not really any sense.
Right.
But there's also the extending the longevity of the structure is also, you should be thinking, and that's why you're saying the structural bracing up here, this added, we're extending the longevity of the building, so these are things that add to that.
I'm curious, where did you pick that up from?
I don't remember, but it was part of that, something I read or some discussion.
That's almost word for word what the Attorney General said regarding this particular cost of project. It doesn't extend to the building, upgrading the structure. So that's the basis upon which he said,
That's why they're in the structural repair. So, the anchoring, so anchoring your mechanical roof, put it on the roof, just so it doesn't fall off, well, it makes the longevity of it, that's not a structural repair that we consider.
and when I was talking to the building department, yeah, that's the color that they had made. Okay, we'll move on. I'm sorry, hold on a second. Yeah. Well, that's where we live in, is, nickel and dining. If you've got a project that's this big, then what do you do? And it's a judgment call, case by case. One of the things I've seen done where a structural repair project essentially was work only in the basement. They were putting new shear walls in the basement, so Oshkosh's call on that one was, okay, the basement area has to meet the accessibility requirements, the toilet rooms, it happens to be staff only at that point, so they only made the staff toilet rooms accessible. But yeah, those are all gonna be kind of case by case. Yeah. And then sometimes, like I said, with the electronic healthcare, they can be very far reaching. So each one's a little different. All right, we're gonna move on. Oshkosh also goes through a couple of elements here. They discuss how to deal with when you're replacing a single element. So if your project, just like we're talking about, is a finite project, and all your project is replacing that, then what do you do? So then Oshkosh has said, okay, then you can just do that, and you're not gonna trigger cap and trap. Now, if your project is a little bigger, there's a point at which you've got the whole room. You're doing enough work in this room, the whole room would have to be made accessible. When you reach that point, is a loosey-goosey judgment call, but the concept is out there. I think you all appreciate the concept. Then there's discussion in our talks about room projects that are not in a room, where the project can't be defined as a radiology project. It's not one of those kind of things. The project is doing stuff here, which then you get to that whole find toilet rooms need to be built, access compliance, which ones serve all of these areas, how is that really going to be handled? It's kind of a case by case. Sometimes they will say, well, we'll let you put central toilet rooms here that will say serve all of those. That's kind of a reasonable.
So the how will the electronic health record computer trigger CASI or environment?
So that was a good question. And it's, in my world, it's walking a fine line of even really trigger access. I had a hard time making that call myself.
Does it change the usability of the room?
Well, I mean, really, when you put a computer on the wall, it sits out this far, your path of travel goes right along the front, and between the bed and the wall. The vast majority of these do legitimately change the accessibility of the room. So, actually, I just, what you see the most usually person are going to do.
I understand placement of the features of sitting in a room and some consider how facility, but in that case, we're just maybe taking an appointment, like anybody would put a computer in a room. That does not trigger now with like travel. Requirement.
So what we got into, let me just finish this one response here. So the project it's 90% electrical. It's quite a lot of electrical that pushes through the wall and down to the point here, and we put a computer on the tail end of the electronics. So we have to get it first. There's a lot of electronics going on that you can't just do without first. But this part of the real construction work is putting blocking in the wall, anchoring this to the wall. We have to say, this is real 2010 building code doesn't use the term toilet rooms. It uses the term sanitary facilities. So when they say, well, that sink that's in the back of the room, it's a part of the room that you're working in. Not only do you do all the toilet room work, you're also going to upgrade all of the sinks that happen to be in the room that you're working in. And really, very information.
Were these the big undertakes when they were doing it, or these, I've been in facilities that have flat screen, 10 pounds, molly bolted to the wall, because it's light, and,
Yeah, these are,
so these, I mean, they didn't affect, they didn't stick out, they're 6 inches from the wall, they didn't affect.
here's also on this. Let me just finish this one there. So they keep your-
So I think it's my thing is, you're right, 90% electrical, these toggles you're putting to the wall, because that's all we needed for the structure of it, they're getting, running power along the way.
Yeah.
So, I just,
Let me respond to that. So we're finding because of this causes such an enormous issue. Our hospitals, I think CASI or some of the others, they put the computer on wheels. And then you've got this remote current. And then it's not really part of the architecture, and it really relieves you from a lot of these headaches.
well, I think like Bob would have, like, interpreted that.
Oh, yeah. There-
My question is, I had a discussion the other day on this with that sink that you had indicated, or the lab, with it being in that particular circumstance, would that require a new clearance under it, or would it be, according to parallel approach, as a wet bar, with the exception?
Yeah, I had that conversation with the folks outside. They don't buy I personally agree with you that the exception that allows a parallel approach to a kitchenette or a bar, this ought to be the best example if they don't know anything. Now, in the context of a healthcare facility, a treatment room, those fixtures are for staff use. The real intent is for staff to work, and our squad has taken the position that they are there for common use. You could have 15 different medical staff using that same fixture, they're calling it common use. So on that basis, they require these things.
But it has the exception for scrub sinks,
And scrub sink is different.
because that's in a surgery room.
Yeah, sure, but there's almost no feasible way to make, because the surgeons have to put their whole arm down into it. It literally goes deep enough that you can't get the required knee space.
So the Lifeline 3 project,
Oh, no.
I can't save you from things in California. It really can come down to a legal interpretation and even a policy and procedure change, but you can't use that in California and get by with it because it's building code. Any other state, you can, establish policy and procedure, put up a sign that says the city can hang washing fixtures only. I have another client that's done that. They're not in California, and I have warned them that, this may not technically be compliant, but they have settled with the complainant, and that's how they're getting around that. And they're expanding, getting further and further west, and when you get to California, you probably. But it really has become a legal interpretation outside of California, that doesn't help you with this.
so with that being said, does the federal ADA then look at the parallel approach? I'm just curious, because I run into this.
That section only applies to transit lodging, guest rooms and suites.
The exception, I think it varies for frequent, I was shifting gears there.
It's
What I'm
essentially,
thinking of is referring to a kitchenette, and a kitchen area where you have no.
because it mentions wet bar, and then you go to the definition of wet bar.
Yeah, so I didn't do good, honest analysis, say, a medical treatment area is kind of like a bar. I wouldn't make that call myself.
You know, you can make that for the clinical wash site, it's a lab situation, it's, not the AV exam room.
when I go that far.
By definition,
I thought that the way you could get to the root of it is, if the sink is in a room, if the sink is a primary function sink in a room, then it would be required to have a heat space. If not, and this is something I remember from some code language somewhere, that if it's not part of the primary function of the room, then the parallel approach is allowed. So Ashbad said that we don't buy this.
That was correct. But
It's an
they're
example.
not the only building department we deal with.
Okay,
Yeah.
so would you clarify, are you saying that that does not trigger passive travel?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
So I'm saying here, there's a point at which you do one thing, okay, they're gonna say, you just replace that one thing, you're not gonna trigger passive travel. If you do two things, maybe, by the time you get to 3 or 4 things in a room, a building department will simply say, okay, look, you're doing a real project here, you're upgrading this room, and then not only are you, your scope of work is the room, you're also going to have to travel. But exactly where that point is a judgment call. Did you do that? Want to say something else? Yeah, but I'm glad I want to keep this something on the trail. I'm sorry.
One quick follow-up. You touched on it just briefly when you said, well, the sink is being used by staff. And, in this exam room here, the example, one side of the exam table has all the clearance, and then the other side has no.
Yeah. So you're way ahead of me.
We're
We're going to try to run this exam, but what are you kind of getting at?
Well, the room itself truly isn't accessible for all users.
Yeah.
Public patients would come in and then staff really do not have.
Yeah, we're going to go into that a little bit more later. In short, our position is that the staff, they don't have to have access to every place. The staff requires maybe to climb up the ladder, that we're okay to have staff shimmy on the skinny side of the room and work back here. In fact, in many cases, that's the only way we can make some of the work in existing buildings.
As long as,
Does that change the type 2 facility?
I'm not sure what you're going to say. Oh,
Maybe, it depends on how the room function, how the room functions, where it's located. There's just more factors.
let's say, the federal facility,
It's still a, it depends. If you offer a service in that room that you can relocate to another room instead of having to replace, remove those barriers, that's, remember it's a cat with a light skin. Take off the light.
it's just a sticky issue. Or at least a sticky issue.
I have never used that phrase in my lifetime.
We're going to get into the same laboratory handbook and history thing later. It's a huge discussion. Well, let me move on. Okay, also, the Oshkosh plan finishes out with a couple of issues. The one thing I wanted to touch on here is item 12, the 200-foot rule. So this is not an exact science. If your project is here, the toilet runs the surface area of alteration. So, say your toilet rooms are here, and they're within 200 feet. The 200-foot rule of thumb has a history that goes back, but it's not in the code anywhere at this time. It's not in the ADA that I see anywhere at this time. It has a history to it, which is hard to find, but it's out there. In this case, Oshkosh has grabbed onto it and they put it in their can saying a reasonable distance for toilet rooms shall be 200 feet. The real question comes in, okay, say you have toilet rooms that are close areas of this project that are the accessible toilet rooms. OSHPD is clearly saying, yes, that is absolutely acceptable. And we had a fairly good sized debate on this topic just yesterday on one of our conference calls, with one of our tasks calling in to a conference call that turned into a 45-minute discussion about whether this is really okay, whether OSHPD really made the right call or not. So I don't want to stretch this thing out too far, other than to say, OSHPD, a lot of building departments that I've worked with will accept, this is reasonable, that there's a point at which you're not really helping much by making sure you've upgraded that one, which costs another $80,000, when there's one that's already accessible that's here. But that's the point to be argued. Okay? I'm going to keep this on track with time and then move on. So, I'm going to do a quick case study. The same campus that I showed a picture earlier. This particular project is on the third floor of this part of the hospital. Interesting thing about the project, it's a no construction project. There is no construction intended. They are simply converting it from one use to another use. As most of you are probably aware, changing use triggers access compliance. So the project that we submitted to OSHPD says we're not going to use it for this use anymore, now we're going to use it for this use. And so here's our drawings that show access compliance. So I'm going to try to make some technology work for me here. I've got the drawings on screen. So this is the hospital floor plan. The project is in this triangular area here. So as we do the path of travel exercise, the project scope is here. Everything inside of the project scope must be compliant. Then we go through, okay, 5 toilet rooms. The patient toilet rooms are inside of the patient bedroom for the most part. This is a patient bedroom wing. I don't know if it shows very well from back there. You'll see it. This drawing shows the actual unit a little more better. So the gray areas are the accessible patient bedrooms. So we go through the scoping exercise. 10% of the rooms must be accessible. So they've got 30 rooms. They've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 10%. So we comply with the accessibility requirements inside the project for the scoping. And we got to go through the toilet room thing. So then we've got toilet rooms that are provided, separate male and female, and staff and patients. This one here is the staff female toilet room. It's accessible. This one is an accessible patient toilet room. It is unisex. So that toilet room there, that's accessed off the main corridor system. It's not in somebody's patient bedroom. This one is a non-accessible staff unisex, so that one doesn't really count. This one is the accessible public female. And so here's where the rub came in as we do our path of travel exercise. There was an accessible female staff on that floor. We went down one floor for the staff, and I believe that was this one. Oh, you know what? I'm on the wrong drawing. This other drawing should show it. So this is the third floor where the project is. This is sort of a mini version of the floor below. And that shows the non-accessible staff, and this shows the accessible public mail phone, and then the accessible drinking fountains. So I don't want to get too deep into this, other than to show that our path of travel exercise we had to show OSHPD was, there's the project, then we show the path of travel from the project area, physically down the elevators and out the front door. We've got our drinking fountains here, our telephones there. The yellow shows the path of travel, and then we go out to the public way. I've got in green the accessible parking areas. So this shows our accessible parking stalls. Our passenger loading zone is in here. We happen to have accessible parking here, but that parking really serves the ER. So in the spirit of doing this, one of the questions that comes up is which parking areas? And as one of your architects, you know, they sometimes gains the system and go, oh, well, they've got accessible parking out here. So say you've got accessible parking here, but left down here. So you go, oh, well, we'll show our kind of travel going up to here. Well, really, that's supposed to be serving the ER. And this is not an ER project. I would think we should call them on that and say, no, your accessible parking stalls that serve this project, reasonably speaking, should be the ones down here. Not exactly, Chris.
Since the change of use is defined as an alteration, what was your project valuation that you based your 20% as travel?
There is language that says change of use triggers it.
I'm sorry?
There is language that says the changing of use is the definition of travel.
Right. It's an alteration, so you only have to have travel based on your project valuation. And if you said you had no construction, therefore no valuation, you've got $0 to spend on that travel.
You're going to spend that differently. Your obligation is to provide the accessible capital travel obligation up to 20% of your budget. Now, your budget is 0. That doesn't mean you don't have an obligation. It just means it would theoretically cap out at some point, but we don't have.
But they still need to go through the exercise of showing half the travel and what things weren't up to current code, even though you didn't have to spend any money to upgrade.
Well, the call that was made was not that you're really doing it. Theoretically, you say there's a valuation to what you have done, and pull out a number that would cover the value of that, but that's going to be a least exercise. But in this case, Bill and Mark is saying, we're not going to buy, and you don't have to do anything as the rule here. So what this costs, now if it costs $1 million, you might go back and say, well, our path of travel of $1 million is a little out of proportion to our 0 construction cost, and then you negotiate. I assume that you got that?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that there's a change of use triggers upgrading the area in and of itself, and then in addition to that, you have to have a sound obligation. So I think that might be involved.
That's true. Yeah. So the project itself has to be requirement. And when I tell you, I tend to exaggerate sometimes. The project was not a no construction project. It's a change of use, but as a function of doing that, there were things that were done inside here. Yeah, but there was something else.
So let's say it was kind of an office area, and they want to change it into a big conference area. So now you've got change of use. And now, because of change of use triggers another text, then you base your valuation based upon that construction is triggered by the change of use requirements.
You guys bring up a good point. You know, you could say, you could make the case that
That would make sense.
construction project,
That makes sense.
that travel obligation should be a portion of that. But there is a point at which that may not make sense under, you know, I'm not sure, as like an example.
I'm not sure, if you change the use of the space, you need to come to the construction to, it doesn't say you must go out for the accessible.
Well, it's an alteration.
But it is defined as an alteration. Change of use is in that definition.
20%.
We got that quite a bit where a residence was being changed from someone's accounting office, and they weren't doing anything other than taking out the old furniture and bringing in new furniture, so there was really no, maybe $1,000 being spent, well, typical house on a raised foundation, so the area of alteration, the living room, those things, they had to comply. But, you know, there was no money to spend to make the path to travel, and that was always one of the big arguments, as well as the entire property, because now it's going from residential to commercial, the entire property, the area of operation, or is it just the area that they were gonna have the public come into, you know, the bathroom. So it's a huge issue.
So if you're a business, you look at what you guys think about.
Again, it was one of those things where we tried not to use the code as a sledgehammer, but more as a benign solution, to say that if in fact you were going in there and you were a single person, business spending $1,000, we're gonna try and, you know, treat you gently. If you're coming in as part of, you know, a nationwide thing that has the resources, and you're just happen to be using this place as a clean easy, that we might look at it a little differently.
We never get to that about.
Yeah.
Education for my production on the topic, on USA, and basically he said that, for example, the other college is construction, you know, you have upstairs. You have the obligation to make that restaurant as a new business accessible, completely accessible with the right things for them. You know, so changing the use from a house to a restaurant to this.
Yeah, I mean, it could be sued in a heartbeat.
Well, there's a difference between EDA obligations under versus what the CDC would require as a basic permit. And I look at it more as, okay, what would the CDC require as a basic permit? Yeah, they might have some obligations, you know, under EDA, a lot more stringent than CDC, but I had to do and just couldn't make them put in a ramp or whatever.
Suggest not using a facility because the very fact of converting it to this kind of business as the open facility inherently makes the facility accessible. And sometimes it seems to me like I've had, you know, friends who are in business who say, we should be catching this facility.
That's a business facility. I think that wraps up our discussion of job construction. Okay,
Both numbers like that.
I think I'm going to blow up. I've got another example of a similar thing, but I think we've got the point. So, questions, and then we'll take a break. Depending if we're getting questions on some travel issues, there's 101 different examples and varieties. Let me address that. So that was the case for our project. I don't remember what the project valuation was. It was over 500,000. So my boss is accurate. Hopefully I'm doing good. So the project was well over the threshold. It triggered access compliance. Oftentimes we do this as part of the deal. You do this travel exercise. When we did it, it was like, holy smokes, this is several $100,000. We're almost upgrading the entire hospital on 3 floors for access compliance and toilet rooms and ribbon pads. So we went to Ashland and said, look, can we agree that we don't have to do everything? And they used 20% as a guideline, and they said, well, we're not going to go with 20%, we'll go with 30%. If you use 30% of your construction budget for upgrades, at that point, we will let you triumphal, and you can. And it was really actually a relief for us because it could have been much higher than 20%. Yeah, actually it is. Yeah. Yes, Steve.
So there are 2 more types of benefits. The slide renovation, traffic traffic, free parking spaces, no accessible parking. Also, you stay outside the building, or
There's 2 separate projects.
well, let's say you're close to the street. You're going to do the stop renovation, you're going to enter the second building, and then
Well, and I frankly, I would agree, that's where I would want to go myself, it's, exterior work, there's really not any meaning to tracing the path of travel or something like that. I have a hard time explaining.
But then the second part is where you can do it for parking spaces. You're putting in your executive parking. Is that trigger pattern?
Let me explore that a bit. So is your project building for parking stalls, one of which or maybe all four of which are accessible?
And that's exactly.
This is like the master barrier removal. Because it's barrier removal, if you get an exception, it doesn't trigger.
Well, we even look at the parking lot is accepted, but you only have to do the parking lot, you don't do that.
It goes the same as what Chris said, there's no path of travel to the area of alteration to an accessible parking space.
Right, and we've read it, yeah.
It's almost like you gotta get to the parking spot somewhere.
The path of travel is
Or either way, you either limited to the parking.
You gotta get,
Yeah, you gotta get your
the question is, is it dragging it?
Doesn't drag it in.
Well, I think it relates to that circling with the word to. There's no path of travel to the parking lot, it's from the parking lot. You don't have a path of travel to the parking lot.
Well, you do, you need to build it.
Well, yeah, but that's not part of your area, not part of your area of alteration.
Well, let's expand that. I mean, I think it's a great example. If we extend that, if you're building a new parking area that's got 25 parking stalls, it's not this small, it's a relatively good sized project. If you all were doing the playground of this, what call would you make? Would you say it doesn't trigger access?
If it's new, no, it does trigger the access. It's a facility that is new, and so therefore you need to have
It
it together.
has to meet the parking stall requirements. But then triggering the path of travel for toilet rooms, drinking fountains, telephones, I would say that sounds kind of odd. So if I like to pass it through the, is this really weird test? Really weird, require toilet rooms as part of the parking lot project. I don't know what that would look
Generally, by definition, the toilet rooms that serve the area of alteration, so you can really argue that the toilet rooms serve the parking lot. Generally, that's how you separate it. They separate it.
I still think there's more to it there, and that, you've got a lot of buildings that are existing conditions, which didn't have time to stop away. If you take one of those buildings on the side, and all of those, where you're spending a lot of money on that building, I think most jurisdictions will require at least that public way not to try to install on potentially parking on the site, maybe not on the inside of the building. Because of that fear of, value added to a building, which in theory, the concept of improving the facility for access.
There should be a building this one?
No.
And there should be one.
You're depending on this. So if you're servicing, you're driving your division, you just don't have to try to watch with, for traffic divisions for. Depending on what you're doing, it's not one of those items solely very removable.
It brings up a larger issue. There's 1,000 different examples of different kinds of projects that are remodeling the building, and each one is a little bit different and unique. What if you're doing this? What if you're doing this? And it's, I think that it's a real case by case, so you have to, in my opinion, apply the code in a reasonable fashion. And that makes reasonable sense.
I got a similar, we take a hospitality environment, but it's just satisfy building code requirements of the state of California. Because it's usually also comes in,
we're within those limits. We're gonna take a break, we're gonna get snacks, and then we'll come back and we'll, let's take just 10 minutes, set 15, and make a meeting.